Hey there, old souls. It's Dr. Jonathan again, and today the topic is poetry. It's interesting when I look back at my spiritual journey specifically, which is really what brings us all here to this video and this newsletter and website. But poetry has been more than pivotal in my process and journey, and I'm very curious to know if it has been true for you as well. Poetry has been essential for my growth and development and spirituality for probably more reasons than I even acknowledge or I even think about. When I was very young and I began having my earliest experiences of spirit and what people would probably call meditative or non-ordinary states, poetry was the only way I could articulate what I was going through. I guess I could have journaled, but journaling like writing in prose or sentences about my feelings and what I was experiencing made no sense at all. The experiences were too emotional. They were too real. They were too transcendent. They were too intuitive. They were far beyond anything that logical language or even sentence construction could contain. And in reading poetry and exploring the many ways that other people have expressed their complex feelings and experiences through poetic form, and specifically the way the writings of the world's spiritual teachers and mystics have been, I won't say predominantly, but significantly translated and formatted in the form of poetry. If you think of Rumi, was he writing poetry consciously at the time, or was he just writing? And we see it now poetically. Meister Eckhart, again, was he thinking of what he wrote as poetry, or is that just the format that contains it? And of course, I could go on. Saint Teresa of Avila, the Buddha, even the words of Jesus. So many times these things, when excerpted, are presented in a poetical form. When I say a poetical, I don't even know if that's a word, but when I say in the format of poetry, what I'm really talking about is a form in which the feeling of the words informs the pattern and structure of the words. So yes, in some cases that's rhyming. Some of you hear poetry and you think rhymes. For some of you, it's about cadence. So there's a rhythm, a repetition. For some of you, it's about word choice and selection and the freedom to be highly evocative, non-literal. More, you might say, referencing or creating a feeling for the reader rather than a thought. And then, of course, when we look at the writing of people like E.E. Cummings, and there's many others who deconstructed language the way he did, but he was a huge influence on me, then we realize that even the way we put the words on the page says something about what we're trying to communicate. In particular, deconstructed writing, I think, is a way to articulate a deconstructed experience of the world. And that doesn't mean a patternless world. It doesn't mean a designless world, but it means one that does not succumb to the rigid conventions of society. I think that is very much what poetry helps us move beyond. So again, for me, poetry was the most significant vehicle in the earliest days, or years, I should say, of my own spiritual journey, and was absolutely essential in me articulating what I was feeling, thinking, experiencing. Being able to put it on paper allowed me to feel it again, to return to it. My poems for me were very much almost like ceremonial tools, right? It was like a ceremony to create. It was like a ceremony to read them. It was a portal, right? A gateway to re-enter the experience. I think that the poetry was also a way to reflect on my own understanding, to evolve my own understanding, to take things that were so close and put them outside myself so I could maybe understand them better or differently, or for that matter, share them. And I found throughout the years, and this is still very true for me, that when I am looking for inspiration, when I am wanting to be nourished, of course, I love to read spiritual writings and teachers and authors. I love to listen to spiritual writings and teachers and authors, and I certainly love to watch, documentaries and artistic portrayals of spiritual teachers, authors, and so on. But there's nothing for me like having a powerful book of spiritual poetry beside my bed or at my desk, or to read through before I speak or before I share. They're still very much gateways for me. And when I don't have 15 minutes for a practice, I often have 2 minutes for a poem. And I think one of the things that is so compelling about poetry is, while it is wildly more personal than the average article or prose, it is also probably the more transparent medium. In other words, when I read spiritual poetry, or poetry with a spiritual intention or focus or image, despite how completely intimate that is for the poet, I experience it more in terms of what it's pointing me towards. And that's usually a feeling in myself, or the existence of something in the world, or a connection with spirit or energy. And I think that's another dimension of poetry that's worth talking about, which is poetry is kind of analogous. It's an analogy in a sense. The reason why poetry is so effective and valuable for people on the spiritual path is the same reason why convention is often the enemy of the spiritual path, or a barrier to the spiritual path. Now, not always, of course, but I would say often. Overly structured, overly predictable, overly conditioned thinking, acting, doing, just as with poetry, limits us from being in touch with our innermost self, our soul, and that which is beyond the soul. And so poetry illustrates something for us, whether we actually are poetry lovers or not. And obviously some of you won't be. Now, I'm going to wrap this up in a moment, because I'd like to invite you to submit a poem that you've written to the Old Soul Republic. Now, we're going to put this in the newsletter. So there's an email address in the newsletter that you can send your poetry to. I am going to ask you that your poetry is not Gilgamesh or Homer's Odyssey. We're going to try to keep the poems that we feature shorter, which means like a conventional page or less. We cannot feature every poem, whether it's because of content, suitability, too many submissions, or let's face it, maybe it doesn't come across clearly and needs some polish. It's not personal. Whatever the reason your poem is not chosen, please, it may just be that we had another poem to choose, and the newsletter can't be an endless scroll. So, having said all that, the value of choosing a poem to share with the Old Soul Republic is not fame or notoriety or praise. It's going through the process of searching your soul to ask yourself, what would I share if I could? And do I have something that I love, or something that I'm proud of, or something that I want other people to know or feel or experience with me? The simple selection and submission process itself is a kind of spiritual practice. And then, of course, we will be able to submit and share some of these in the newsletter. And so I'm very eager that this message today is turning into a homework assignment. If you haven't written poetry in a while, get out the pen and spend some time sitting quietly and finding that which needs a voice. There's no format we favor. There's no topic we prefer. And most importantly, I welcome you to remember poetry as a spiritual practice, poetry as a vehicle for connecting with the inner world. Oh, there goes two eagles, two bald eagles right there. I don't know if you can hear them. Poetry ultimately, I pray, I hope, I consider, reflects a way of being. And I hope that's where this journey of poetry is going to take us. That we can begin to consider that life can be lived like poetry, with respect for convention, but the willingness to create and be creative. That life can be lived like poetry, with equal reference to feeling and force and energy as to material matter or approval or that which is predictable. To consider that life can be a poem is really to consider that life can be lived like a ceremony. It's to cherish each moment the way a poet is cautious and careful and thoughtful of each word, each phrase. Poetry reminds us that life can be intentional, and perhaps most significantly, when we live life like a poem, we look for the beauty, the power, the feeling, the truthfulness of each experience, how it helps us to feel our absolute uniqueness in this universe and our profound interconnection. Poetry is often tragic, often sad, often dark, and can be playful, silly, light, compelling, sexual, exposing, vulnerable, trauma healing, trauma depicting. It can be anything and everything that life can be, but what poetry reminds us is that it can all be beautiful. It can all be acceptable. And it can all be lived with dignity and intention. So with that, I welcome poetry into your life. I welcome you to see and feel your life as poetry. And I look forward to sharing some poetry with you.